Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. My name is Emma and today I'm going to be telling you every book that I read in 2018. So happy new year everybody. I hope you guys had a wonderful holiday, a wonderful break from school if you had one, or a break from work or anything else. I hope you guys had a good holiday season. I had a really nice relaxing one. It was a great time away from school and all those other things. I was able to read quite a bit and catch up with family, spend some time with family, and it was just a really great time. Today I'm going to be doing a full wrap-up of 2018 and everything that I read. I'm going to be giving you guys the titles, authors, and my star rating. I've done a couple wrap-ups in the past, and then I also put most of my thoughts on Goodreads as well, so if you wanted a more in-depth look at what I thought about these or like their summaries or anything, I'll link my Goodreads in the description box below. In the year of 2018 I read 84 books, which is the most I've read in a year ever, I think. And they were all so good. I rarely had a less than 3.5 star read, which was incredible. I'm just gonna be going in order. I started off the year in England actually. I went to the University of Birmingham for a semester abroad in England. So I didn't read a ton in the first few months of the year, but as soon as summer hit and I was back working and just literally doing nothing but working and reading, I read a majority of these books. So between May and August it's going to be insane. At the end of the video I'll give you guys what my Goodreads goal for next year is and other reading goals that I've got, but for now let's just go ahead and get right into it. So for the month of January I read a total of 5 books, and since I was away in the UK I didn't bring a lot of physical books with me, and a lot of the books in the first few months are going to be school books as well, but I did read a few ebooks and I listened to a couple of audiobooks over the winter last year because it was easier while I was traveling and going around to just have it on my phone or listen to it on the long drives or plane rides or whatever. So the first book that I read in the year of 2018 was A Darker Shade of Magic by Victoria Schwab. I really liked this book. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I don't have a physical copy with me. It was one of the ebooks that I read. And I'm looking to get a box set of the Darker Shade of Magic series because I did enjoy it and I still haven't read the last one yet, so you know, gotta get on that. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really good. The next book that I read during the month of January was Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard, The Sword of Summer, book 1 in the Magnus Chase series by Rick Riordan. I got this whole series for Christmas last year and I absolutely devoured it. I loved it so much. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars like I do with most Rick Riordan books. The next book that I read was my first book for school that I read during the year of 2018, and that was Transatlantic by Colin McGann. I was taking a class on transatlantic literary relations, and I also gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I thought it was fantastic. The next book that I read during the month of January was The Longest Memory by Fred Daguerre, I think is how you say his name. It was another book that I read for that transatlantic literary relations class, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of January was a reread for me, and it was a very exciting one. I read Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Moving on to the month of February, I started off by reading the second book in the Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard series, which was The Hammer of Thor, and I gave it also 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of February I read as a audiobook, and I read it on the way to and from Liverpool from Birmingham, so I finished it in the 4 hours I think that was. I don't think I listened to it much outside of that. But that book was The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee, and I gave it also a 5 out of 5 stars. I loved it so much. The next book that I read during the month of February was As You Like It by William Shakespeare, and I gave it a 3.5 stars. The next book that I read I also don't have a copy of because I left it at school, but it was Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. If you guys have not read that book, read it. It was phenomenal. I couldn't stop raving about it. I think I was on FaceTime with my mom and I was on FaceTime for an hour just talking about this book as soon as I finished it. It was fantastic. The next book that I read during the month of February was The Garden Party and Other Stories by Katherine Mansfield, and I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of February was another reread, and it was Twelfth Night by William Shakespeare, which I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. And finally, the last book that I read during the month of February I also don't have a copy of, but it was Grounded by George Brant, which was a play. Anne Hathaway did a version of the play actually, which was really good, but I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Moving on to the month of March, I started off the month by again reading the third book in the Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard series, which was The Ship of the Dead, and I loved it. It was a great conclusion. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of March was Drowned by Junot Diaz, which was a set of short stories that I read, or that I rated 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of March was another book that I read on my e-reader for class, which was The Keep by Jennifer Egan, which I gave a 3.5 out of 5 stars. And finally, the last book that I read during the month of March was King Lear by William Shakespeare, which I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. The month of April was a really short reading month for me because I spent most of the month traveling with a few of my friends that I met while I was abroad. I went on a huge 3-week Europe trip, and then I started off another 2-week trip with my cousin right after that. So the next couple months are a little bit short. But the first book that I read during the month of April was Catching Stars by Kayla Keenan, which I was given an advanced reader copy of by Ben Alderson over at Of Tone Books and Of Tone's Publishing. And I loved it. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I thought it was a wonderful debut, and I'm excited to read everything else that Kayla comes out with. I've been following her on Twitter, and I think she's awesome, and I'm really excited to see what else she comes up with. And the only other book that I read during the month of April was A Gathering of Shadows by Victoria Schwab, which I also gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. So the month of May was the month that I came back from my exchange, and it was the first month where I had about 2 weeks off before work started. So I had a little bit more reading than I normally do, or normally did during the rest of the year, and it was my first week back to work as well, which is where I do most of my reading in the summers. This is where it's going to get quite interesting because pretty much all of my ratings for every book I read in the summer was like 4 or 5 stars, so I had a really good reading year this year. But the first book that I read during the month of May was The Burning Maze, which was the third book in the Trials of Apollo series by Rick Riordan, which I also gave 5 out of 5 stars to. Pretty much everything Rick Riordan reads I'm going to give 5 out of 5 stars to because it's fantastic, full of wonderful mythology that's accurate and depicted in a way that's great for children and makes me so happy. Not just children, everybody. The next book that I read during the month of May was Caraval by Stephanie Garber, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. The next book that I read during the month of May was one of my most anticipated books of the year, and it was A Court of Frost and Starlight by Sarah J Maas, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. I know a lot of people hated on this book because nothing really happened, but I mean, you see all the time on like Tumblr and Twitter and everything like that, people wanting to have like a book where people, their favorite characters are just doing like the most mundane things, and they're always just like, I'd read an entire book with that. It's like, this is like the Christmas special of the Court of Thorns and Roses series. I thought it was great. I thought it was wonderful being able to read about what life was like after such an insane series ended, and like people dealing with the aftermath. And I love reading about these characters. I love these characters. I could read them do nothing all day and I'd be happy. But I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read during the month of May was Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. This was my first introduction to the Grishaverse. I hadn't read it before this year, and I devoured it this year. And it was just phenomenal. Everything about it I loved so much. And I'm so excited for King of Scars to come out. You have no idea. So moving on to the month of June, the first book that I read during the month of June was Siege and Storm by Leigh Bardugo, which I also gave a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of June was Ruin and Rising by Leigh Bardugo, which I also gave 5 out of 5 stars. You're about to see a pattern emerging. The next book that I read during the month of June was Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, which I also gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. If I could have given it 10, I would have given it 10. I love this series so much. I'm making my boyfriend read it right now. The next book that I read during the month of June was Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, which I also gave 5 out of 5 stars. I think this was just a year of series for me and sequels because that's pretty much all I read, but they were all fantastic, so I'm okay with it. The next book that I read during the month of June was Kiss of Deception by Mary E. Pearson, the first book in the Remnant Chronicles, which again I'd never read and I loved. I really did enjoy it. The first book in the series, I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of June was The Heart of Betrayal by Mary E. Pearson, which I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. And then the next book that I read during the month of June, you can probably guess, it was The Beauty of Darkness by Mary E. Pearson, which I gave 5 out of 5 stars too. That series wasn't nearly as like complete 5 out of 5 stars as like the Grishaverse, but over the course of the series I came to love it more, and I read this whole thing in like 3 days. I loved it. The The next book that I read during the month of June was Legendary by Stephanie Garber. Pretty much as soon as it came out, I read this book. But I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, and I'm so looking forward to the next one finale that comes out pretty soon. The next book that I read during the month of June was The 1000th Floor by Katharine McGee, which I gave a 3 out of 5 stars. Here comes another series that's going to be quite long, but one of my new absolute favorite series. And the next book that I read during the month of June was The Demon King by Cinda Williams-Chima, which I gave a 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of June was The Exiled Queen by Cinda Williams-Chima, which I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of June was The Grey Wolf Throne by Cinda Williams-Chima, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. And the last book that I read during the month of June was The Crimson Crown, which I also gave a 5 out of 5 stars to by Cinda Williams-Chima. And that concluded the Seven Realms series. Another pattern is about to emerge. For the month of July, the first book that I read was Flamecaster by Cinda Williams-Chima, which is the Shattered Realms series, which is a continuation series of the Seven Realms series following the children of the characters from the first one. So good, gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of July was Shadowcaster by Cinda Williams-Chima, the second book in the Shattered Realms series. And the next book that I read during the month of July was Stormcaster by Cinda Williams-Chima, the third book in the Shattered Realms series. The next one comes out in March, and I'm so excited, you have no idea. Shadowcaster I gave 4 out of 5 stars to, Stormcaster I gave 5 out of 5 stars to. I think I forgot to tell you that, so sorry. The next book that I read during the month of July I read as an ebook, so I don't currently have it, but it was Graceling by Kristin Cashore, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. On to the next series. The next book that I read during the month of July is the start of another series, which is Fallen Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes, which I gave a 4 out of 5 stars to. This series makes me so happy because the author is Canadian and I think she's from Ontario, which is where I'm from, so it makes me really happy and proud, and I love it so much. The next book that I read during the month of July was Rebel Spring by Morgan Rhodes, which was the second book in the Fallen Kingdoms series, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of July was Gathering Darkness, which is the third book in the Fallen Kingdom series by Morgan Rhodes, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. The next 3 books that I read actually all in one day, so it tells you how much I really love this series and how much I read while I'm at my cottage. But the next book that I read during the month of July was Frozen Tides by Morgan Rhodes, the fourth book in the Fallen Kingdom series, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of July, shocker, is Crystal Storm, the fifth book in the Fallen Kingdom series by Morgan Rhodes, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. And again, the next book that I read during the month of July was Immortal Reign, the sixth and final book in the Fallen Kingdom series by Morgan Rhodes, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read is a bit of a departure from all the fantasy that I was reading at the beginning of the summer, and going back to historical fiction, which I absolutely adore. And this one was no exception. I read The White Queen by Philippa Gregory, which was one of her Tudor novels, and it follows the life of Elizabeth Woodville, and I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read made me so happy, and it was The Language of Thorns by Leigh Bardugo, the set of short stories and fairy tales that are all illustrated, set in the Grishaverse, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read during the month of July was Origin by Dan Brown, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. I love Dan Brown's writing. I especially love his Robert Langdon series, which this is, I believe, Da Vinci Code, Angels and Demons, Lost Symbol, if I don't know, 5th one. And it was just as good as the rest of them. Love them all. He needs to continue because I adore them so much. Moving on to the month of August, the first book that I read was Circe by Madeline Miller. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I read her other book, The Song of Achilles, which I've got up there somewhere, that she wrote about 10, 11 years ago, I think, and last summer, and I fell in love. It was fantastic. It was a retelling of the Iliad, so the Battle of Troy between and the big story of Achilles, and it was insanely good, so good. So I've been this was probably my most anticipated book of last year. As soon as I found out Madeline Miller was writing another one, I got so excited because she's an expert, she knows what she's talking about, and she can write Greek mythology so well, and Circe was no exception. It was phenomenal. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars, obviously, and everybody needs to read it. The next book that I read during the month of August, I also read on an ebook, and it was the sequel kind of to Graceling by Kristin Cashore. It was called Fire, and I loved it. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. And we're back to the series. The next book that I read during the month of August was The Queen of the Tearling by Erica Johansson, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. And the next book that I read during the month of August was The Invasion of the Tearling, which I gave a 3 out of 5 stars to. Didn't like it as much as the first, but the last one redeemed it in my eyes. And the next book that I read during the month of August was The Fate of the Tearling by Erica Johansson, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. The next book that I read during the month of August was Sea Witch by Sarah Henning. I love this book so much, I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. It was like a retelling of, or an origin story, I should say, for Ursula from The Little Mermaid, which was awesome, and I loved it so much. And we're back to the series once again. This time more of a historical fiction-based series, which, again, I love. And the first book that I read was The Thief by Megan Wallen-Turner, which I've heard so much about from Reagan over at Prose Project, and it was great. The first book I rated a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of August was The Queen of Atolia by Megan Wallen-Turner, the sequel to The Thief, which I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read during the month of August was The King of Atolia, the third book in the Thief series, which by Megan Wallen-Turner, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. Moving on to the month of September, this was the month that I went back to school, so you'll start to see more school books included in this list. But before school started, I finished off the Queen's Thief series, and so the first book in September that I read was A Conspiracy of Kings by Megan Wallen-Turner, and I rated this book a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I decided to take a break from the Queen's Thief series, and I read As Old as Time by Liz Braswell, which is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, and it was incredible. I loved it so much. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Everybody read these Twisted Tales series. They're all incredible. Yeah. The next book that I read during the month of September was Thick as Thieves by Megan Wallen-Turner, the 5th book in the Queen's Thief series, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The first book that I read for school in the month of September was Fun Home, a family tragicomic, which was for my graphic novels class. It's by Alison Bechdel, or Bechdel. If you've ever heard of the Bechdel test that most people place on like movies and books and stuff about whether or not it's got more than 2, I believe, female characters that actually have lines and have a story that's not related to the men in the series, that comes from Alison Bechdel. She's a fantastic writer. This was her memoir autobiography, and it had such pretty pictures. And I read it for school in September. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read during the month of September was The Raven Steals the Light, which was a compilation of Indigenous origin stories, creation stories. They were written down and like compiled by Bill Reed and Robert Bringhurst, and the drawings were done by Bill Reed. I'll show you a couple of them because they were just gorgeous. If you can see that. So pretty, similar to what's on the cover. Loved it. It was great. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Moving on to the month of October, the first book that I read was Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, one of my textbooks for my graphic novel class. Thought it was great. It's a graphic novel about graphic novels. It's pretty interesting, and if you're interested in graphic novels, I'd give it a go. I give it a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of October was Essex County, The Complete Essex County by Jeff Lemire, which was another graphic novel for my graphic novel class. It was fantastic. It was 3 different stories, like going through different generations of this one family that lives in rural Ontario. And it was great. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of October was Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor, which is probably one of my favorite books of the year. I loved it so much. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. It was incredible. I devoured it in like a day. And yeah, everybody read this book because it was incredible. The next book that I read during the month of October was The Wicked Deep by Shay Earnshaw, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of October was The Complete Persepolis, books 1 and 2 by Marjane Satrapi, which I read again for my graphic novels class and just loved so much. I cried so much. It was incredible. Everybody needs to read this. 5 out of 5 stars. Absolutely so good. And then the last and final book that I read during the month of October was The Diviners by Lippa Bray, which I buddy read with Joe over at Average Joe Reads. Incredible. Loved it so much. I have the sequels now, so I can finally finish it. But I give it a 5 out of 5 stars. It was wonderful. Moving on to the month of November, I was reading this book all from September, October to November because I was doing a novel study, I guess, for it. It was the only book we read for one class, and it was Moby Dick by Herman Melville, and I gave it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. I didn't enjoy it very much. to make up for how much I didn't like Moby Dick. The next book that I read during the month of November was Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J Maas, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. Again, if I could give it 20, I would. It was incredible. It was a great finale to the Throne of Glass series. I enjoyed it so much. I enjoyed every character's ending, and it just made me so happy. The next book that I read during the month of November was an illustrated book of Genesis by Robert R. Crumb, which I gave a 3 out of 5 stars to. It was interesting as somebody who's never read the Bible before, reading a story that I've heard of so many times and seeing it illustrated, which I thought was really cool. Yeah, it was interesting, so that's why I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Also for my graphic novel class. The next book that I read during the month of November was The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill, which I gave a 4 out of 5 stars to. The next book that I read during the month of November was The Cure for Death by Lightning by Gail Anderson Dargatz, which I gave a 3 out of 5 stars to. So the last book that I read during the month of November I also don't have a physical copy of, but it was the graphic novel The Outside Circle by Patty Laboucaine Benson, which I gave a 4 out of 5 stars to. Lighting might be a little crazy because the sun is setting and it's driving me nuts. But anyway, to round off the video, the month of December was a wonderful month for reading. All of them were great books. But I started off with another reread for me, which was Hamlet by William Shakespeare. Look how cute this tiny little edition is. I love it. I got it at Shakespeare & Co. when I was in Paris over my exchange, and it was wonderful. 5 out of 5 stars, of course, if you know me at all. The next book that I read during the month of December was Sight Witch by Susan Dennard, which was a novella that is a prequel to her Truth Witch series, and the next book is coming out next month, and I'm really excited. I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read during the month of December I also don't have a physical copy of, but it was The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. And the next book that I read during the month of December was the sequel to The Bear and the Nightingale, which was The Girl in the Tower by Catherine Arden, which I also gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. Next up, I read Illuminae by Jay Kristoff and Amy Kaufman, which I gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. Next up, I read The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert, which I also gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. The last 2 books that I read in 2018, which were part of a series that is now part of my new favorite series, or one of my new favorite series. And the first book is Three Dark Crowns by Kendare Blake, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. And finally, the last book that I read in 2018, the last book that I read in December, was One Dark Throne by Kendare Blake, which I also gave a 5 out of 5 stars to. 2018 I can definitely say was a year of series and a year of sequels, which I mentioned earlier on in the video, because that's pretty much all that I read, but all of them were just fantastic. I enjoyed them all so much, and I just loved my whole experience with reading this year from start to finish. There were barely any books that I didn't like. So many new series that have become my favorites, as you can tell from where I display them on my bookcase. They're just so incredible. I think if I can pick top 5 favorite books of the year, it was definitely Strange the Dreamer, Circe, Kingdom of Ash, Three Dark Crowns, and The Bear and the Nightingale. Absolutely. Those are definitely my top 5. I just love them all so much. I've never, in the last few years, I haven't found books that I've liked that much. So I'm just over the moon happy with what I did over 2018. My reading goal for 2018 was 70 books, and I surpassed that by 14, and I read 84, which is insane. This coming year is going to be a little crazy. I don't know what's going to happen. I graduate from my degree in June. This is my last semester of my undergrad, where I'm getting a Bachelor of Liberal Arts in English, which is crazy. So I've got a few books for school to read, and then this summer I'm going to get a bunch of reading done again as well. But come September, I still don't know if I've applied for grad school, but I don't know if I've got in yet. And if I do, I don't know how much reading I'm going to get done. It's going to be kind of crazy come September, which is so far into the future, I know, but just thinking about reading goals and everything, I have to consider that. I don't even want to think about it if I don't get in, so I'm not going to. But I've set my reading goal for this year of 2019 to be 90 books. I know that's a little crazy, but it's 6 more than I read this year. I think I can do that. With how much I read in the summer and over the breaks and everything, I should be able to. I really hope so. I hope you guys enjoyed seeing every book that I read during the year of 2018. This is super fun to film. It's super fun to go back and see my ratings for what I read. As you can tell, there were a lot of 5-star reads, but I read so many good series this year that I'm not even mad about it. I know that I can definitely be critical. I can understand that some books have flaws, but they're not going to make me rate them lower. If I rate my books mainly on the experience that I had while I was reading it. So if I enjoyed a book and it made me happy, it made me cry, if it made me laugh out loud, I'm going to rate it 5 out of 5 stars. That's just how I do it. That's my system. It was an incredible year. I hope next year is just as good. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you are new here. I will be putting out new videos twice a week. I still haven't figured out a new schedule yet now that my semester has changed, but I'm thinking Wednesdays and Saturdays. If not, maybe Wednesdays and Fridays, but we will see. I will let you guys know either on Twitter or in my next video. Comment below letting me know how your 2018 reading year went or your goals for 2019, and I will talk to you guys later. Have a wonderful day.